projet Béné Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès
actuelle de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bongo, Albori, Zoukoli, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Les producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas accès à la terre, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes soient prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% des femmes.
Maya was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. Maya is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Maya is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Maya brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Maya is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaku. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé par collaborer avec le projet Benekadio. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadio, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce que il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadio nous a aidés parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'Anakadi. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site moderne. Nous souhaitons que Benekadio continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Benekadio nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benekadio pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites conçus qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, TechnoServe à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savè et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, TechnoServe a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
TechnoServe nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew TechnoServe a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec TechnoServe est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de TechnoServe, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec TechnoServe le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, nos matériels végétal performants vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la Covid-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. Technoserve Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière Cashew, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cashew, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cashew que ça a été organisé dans le Nord précisément.
Recording in progress.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the 8th Year Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. On behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, a heartfelt gratitude to every partner and sponsor who have continually made it sessions. Kindly note that the session is being held in English French interpretation. And to access this service, locate the globe icon on your screen. Select a preferred language and mute the original sound. We welcome all your questions and need for clarification, and we ask that you drop them all in the Q&A feature and we'll address them after the presentation. Now, without taking much time, join me, welcome Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jim, and you?
Yeah, all good, thanks. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to our 59th, believe it or not, session of the Global Market Encounter of the African Cashew Alliance. Today, we're going to talk about markets, and we're going to focus on some countries. So we'll have a look at the situation in Vietnam, in India, and in Tanzania as the auction develops. And for our second half of the GME, we'll look at the Brazilian cashew sector, something that we don't talk about enough, perhaps. Particularly African stakeholders, we don't maybe talk about enough the situation in Brazil and the developments there. So let's look at the markets to start. So looking at the cashew kernels market, in fact, we haven't seen a great deal of change over the past 2 weeks. Market remains steady, but as I say, there's no fireworks yet. Exports are up. Trade statistics to just about everywhere are very positive. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later. Prices are moving slowly. Prices have moved up a little, particularly at the upper end, the top processors. There is still a need in Vietnam, especially for nearby, particularly for smaller processors, to turn over some of their material to keep their factories running. So that's acting somewhere as an anchor on prices. We started at a low starting point and we remain at historically low prices. And of course, good supply and the economic uncertainty that we've talked about so many times at this event is having an impact on how quickly the market moves. So we're going to start by having a look at the all-important Vietnamese cashew sector, and we'll update what we're seeing there. First thing I think to look at is the raw cashew nut imports to Vietnam. And as you can see on the screen, we've had a really outstanding performance over the last 9 months or so. In fact, in 7 of the 9 months, we've had records for that particular month. And that adds up to just under 2.4 million tons by the 15th of October. And if we look at that, comparing to other years, we can see, for example, looking at the situation this year compared to 22, 2020, 2019, we are way ahead of the curve in terms of the overall imports. I've left 2021 out for reasons I've mentioned so many times, that those figures just aren't reliable and they're just not fixed yet. So when we look at the Vietnam imports, we see not only more volume, but we see a slightly higher average price than last year. These are the customs value. And by the way, the figures I use are always the figures from the Vietnamese Customs Service. There are different versions of the figures, mostly to do with time lags, but I'm using the Vietnamese Customs Service figures. So, more imports, they've come earlier, and they've come at a slightly higher price. If we look at that average import price, we can see that over the course of the year, it has found its way downwards. So here we're looking at not the market price, we're looking at the average import price that was declared to customs in Vietnam when the goods cleared. So we are today at the lowest prices we've seen for some time. Offers are at much higher levels. Of course, the offers at this time of the year are often of higher quality material from Indonesia or from Tanzania. And there you can see $12.75 from Indonesia, I understand, is offered, and Tanzania, $1,300. Some are talking a little higher. We'll come back to that later on. That still means a tight calculation against kernels. The West African material that remains, and there isn't much of it in West Africa, but there is some in Vietnam. That material, because it's lower quality, is at a lower price. So relatively low import prices, pretty competitive import prices. We'll have a look at the sources of supply. So where has Vietnam been buying its raw cashew nuts in 2023? Well, you can see that Côte d'Ivoire and Cambodia dominate, between them 56% of the imports this year. This is January to September. Other important origins, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, all stand out. There are many other origins, of course, but they only together account for 18%. If we have a look at that and compare it to last year, what we can see for the time of year, so we're looking at the end of September, we can see that the imports from Côte d'Ivoire are way ahead of this time last year, 700,000 tons in the customs figures by the end of September 23, compared to 380,000 the same time last year. That probably doesn't mean that there's less going to come or more going to come from Côte d'Ivoire. What it means is it's come that little bit earlier. Look at the other countries. Cambodia down by about 100,000 tons, from just over 700 to just over 600,000 tons. Much more from Nigeria. Nigeria is more than double. Again, that's partly to do with the timing of shipments, but probably in the case of Nigeria, to do with some cross-border trade in West Africa. And Ghana, steadily increasing, 266,000 tons this year. And that's probably a mix of a higher production figure in Ghana and some more cross-border trade, perhaps from Côte d'Ivoire, perhaps from elsewhere, entered into Vietnam with Ghanaian origin on the docks. So pretty positive picture, you'd have to say. What does it mean overall? Well, first of all, it means this raw cashew nuts is being used, it is being exported. We're looking at a record for the period. And this really is remarkable. This shows the underlying strength of demand for cashew nuts worldwide. And I think it also shows, and when we look at where these cashew nuts are going, it shows a spreading of demand. So let's look first of all at the three big destinations. So I picked three countries: China, the Netherlands, because it is the primary point of entry into the European Union, and the United States. All three markets are ahead of last year, which is not too surprising. Last year wasn't a particularly positive year, as you know, but look at the figures for China, very strong figures in China. Relatively strong figures in the US. Now these are shipments we're looking at, so this is what's been shipped from Vietnam. Some of these figures are not showing on the import figures in the United States as yet. So US imports on the US side are still down, but on the shipment side are still up. So that's an encouraging picture for the rest of the year. And looking at the Netherlands and generally the European Union, we expect a fairly slow recovery, but nevertheless a recovery in the import figures. up 38% on last year for China, up 6% for the Netherlands, and shipments up about 7.26% to the United States. This would suggest that we're coming out of the slow trend in the Western markets that was particularly obvious from August 2022 until June 2023. It doesn't mean it's over, but it does mean that the trend, or perhaps the sentiment, has changed. If we look at other destinations, and so I picked a whole range of destinations from the Vietnamese figures, and wherever we look, in East Asia, West Asia, Europe, North America, Oceania, we only find 2 of the top 30 countries where imports or shipments from Vietnam are down. Those 2 countries are Belgium and India. So very positive picture wherever you look, particularly looking at markets that are indicative of where we might be going in the future. Germany, it's turned quite strong. UAE, in fact, throughout the Middle East, very strong trade. Saudi Arabia, you can see, UAE, Iraq, even smaller countries like Kuwait, all showing very positive import figures. So from that point of view, it looks good. So we've looked at imports of RCN, we've looked at exports of cashew kernels. Let's try and make some sense of it. So we divided it into these areas. We look at the crop. The blue is 2022. The grey is the current year. We look at the imports. Import of kernels, because don't forget there's still quite a trade in former kernels into Vietnam for peeling and re-export. The export of kernels, an estimate of domestic disappearance, that could be usage, it could be trade that's not recorded, and then the carry out. So right now, looking at this, it looks to me as if the total carry out calculated, doesn't mean this is in the warehouses, it means everything that's left in the country, about 451,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. Sounds like a lot, but it's only 1.8 months of processing. And that does put a perspective, because the market, and particularly the Vietnamese industry, has got so big that what we once would have considered tremendous volumes are today fairly ordinary. 1.8 months processing, maybe in the quieter time of the year, that's 2 months processing. Question we don't know the answer to, and we can only guess at, is what is in transit in Vietnam, what hasn't been custom cleared, and what is yet to be added to these figures. So this is a key question when we're looking at the supply and demand balance as we come toward the end of the year, is what's left in Vietnam that's not yet committed to processors. But overall, it looks as if, yes, there is quite an inventory in Vietnam, but in the context of this year's exports and this year's overall shipments from Vietnam, it doesn't look as if the market is overstocked, at least in what's been custom cleared so far. So let's look at India. And again, India is showing quite strong imports. We have the September figures. And although India is never going to approach the 2022 record figure, that remarkable 1.4 million tons, it is quite strong. So leaving aside 2022, 2023 would be the strongest year on record. And that's quite interesting. Now, if we look at how that translates into the overall situation, it looks to me in India that taking Jan to September imports, taking into account the crop, and I'm estimating that around 750,000 tons, that's the figures I'm finding in India, we end up with this situation where India needs, and so I say needs, so this is essentially to make ends meet, if you like, about 140,000 tons additional to import. That would bring imports up around the 1.1 million tons from the current 964,000 tons, and that'd be the second strongest year on record. So remarkable performance again. Now we have to also consider that there's no harvest in India till end of February into March, maybe even later than that these days. So India also needs, just as Vietnam does, is a bridge to the new crop. So I'm calculating, based on the fact that the first quarter demand is a little bit less, that it's somewhere between 205,000 and 300,000 tons is needed as a bridge to the new crop. Now, that may not pick up into the import figures during this year. It may be in the early part of next year. But it would seem to suggest that if domestic demand is unchanged, that there will be continued support for RCN. Now, if domestic demand were to go up by just 5%, and that's quite possible in India, Indian demand's been pretty strong. We'll get a better idea in the coming weeks. We could add another 80,000 tons to that. So we are looking at quite a strong situation in India. It looks to me as if the very heavy inventories, and if we look down here, the opening stocks for 2023 were very high. That was because of the high level of imports last year. But looking at that situation, it would seem that the Indian market is giving us signs that it has coped with the carry-in and that it's getting back to a more normal business pattern. And that means that Indian demand must be very strong. Indian demand, you might know, is very difficult to estimate. Cashews is a big business in the country. It's a business that's spread now throughout the country. Production is across quite a widespread area. Processing has moved from its traditional centres in the south, further north, closer to the markets of the north, but it's also still highly present in the southern part of the country. Exports have faded. So this year, it looks as if Indian exports will be around 46, maybe a little bit more than that, 46 to 50,000 tons. Better than last year, but still a fraction of the exports 10 years ago. Nonetheless, still some business to be done in India, still some support for the raw cashew nut market from India, I think, and still some optimism for the Indian cashew sector in terms of the movements in domestic demand. So having looked at India and Vietnam, let's have a look at the supply situation from Tanzania. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, you will have heard the Director General of the Cashew Board of Tanzania, Francis Alfred, talk to us about the situation, talk to us about how the auction works. And let's see then how the auction has progressed over its first couple of weeks of activity. Before we do that, just to remind you of the Tanzanian cashew sector. Tanzania grows really high quality cashews, mostly in the southeast of the country, mostly in the region which is focused on the port of Mtwara for export and processing. But as you can see in the map, these light colored trees, these are areas where there is an expansion of cashew production. This will increase the production of the country. The government has set a very high target. I think 500,000 tons is possible in Tanzania over the coming years. Interestingly, in these new areas, some of these further northern areas, already in Tanga, for example, the crop comes in during the February to May period. So Tanzania could eventually be very unique in that it could be a producer of cashew nuts both in the northern hemisphere season starting in February and the southern hemisphere season starting in September, October. But for now, production remains focused in the southeast of the country in these very famous areas, Lindi, Mtwara, Tandahimba, and so on. Let's have a look at the auction. So you can see this is the Tanzanian raw cashew nut auction. The red bars are the volumes that have been sold each week and the cumulative for this year. So we're looking at a comparison. The auctions take place on Fridays. Up to last Friday, there had been 2 auctions. About 44,000 tons was sold. That's more than double what was sold by the end of October last year. We were seeing much quieter start last year, let's say. This year we've more buyers, and for a start, we've more product sold. But let's remind ourselves it's way behind the 2021 numbers. By this stage of 2021, we were up above 60,000 tons. So we're significantly behind that. If we have a look at the pricing in the auction, so bear with me on this, there's quite a bit of information in here. So in the auction, we have the auction price and we have the highs and the lows. So you can see that compared to the first week, the second week was pretty much the same, slightly higher. Price varies not only on market, but also on the quality of the product available, the tons and its location. Key factor is, what does that mean for the farmers? So when we look at the auction price and we adjust it for some of the costs to the farmers, we can see that the price is a little bit better in dollars this year than last year. Now, prices in Tanzanian shillings are higher this year. The reason for that is the currency is weaker. So this is a key factor, obviously, currency, and the cashew auctions have an impact on the currency in Tanzania. And of course, the currency has an impact on the cashew auctions. So farmers are, at least in dollar terms, at the high end getting a higher price. In shillings, they're getting a significantly better price. Many of them, depending on who you talk to, of course, are not too happy with the prices. If we look at what that means for processors, so one of the issues in Tanzania for processors, and processing is really making a comeback in Tanzania. We're really seeing a lot of interesting projects and developments there, and it looks optimistic for the future. But the cost of raw material, by the time you add on a reasonable trucking charge, local tolls and taxes, prices are still quite high. This remains quite challenging for processors in Tanzania. Let's have a look at what it means on an FOB basis. Well, it looks like something in the region of 11.90 on the high side, 11.30 on the low side. So when we look at these figures, if you're in West Africa, let me try and put the farm gate price into some kind of perspective. This would be equivalent of about 470 CFA a kilo. So higher prices than in West Africa, but don't forget that Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are pretty high quality. You're looking at large nuts, you're looking at outturns 52, 54 in many cases. Processors, for me, this looks tough for processors, difficult calculation. They need to get their processing costs under control, certainly below $400 a ton of raw cashew nuts. That's tough enough to do if you're, mid-size or small cashew factory. These calculations also make some of the offers of raw cashew nuts on a cost and freight basis to India or to Vietnam look a little bit pricey to me. I've heard prices offered around $1,300, even higher, $1,350. Maybe value would be more like maybe something like $1,250, $1,275, something like that. So just trying to draw that comparison then between this year and last year, we're pretty much at the same price level, adjusted in dollars. The highs last year at the beginning of the auction were a little bit higher. The lows were a little bit lower, but we're not far off that range. So let me not get ahead of myself here. Looking at the Tanzanian picture in general, I think pretty positive start to the auction. We've only had 2 auctions. The next one will be on Friday. We would have had 3 by this time last year. 44,000 tons sold by calculation based on the estimate of the crop from the Cashew Board of Tanzania. That means something like 14 to 15% of the crop has already been sold. I understand about 70,000 tons has been received, so there could be another interesting auction in the coming week. Indian buyers, not surprisingly, given what we've looked at just a few minutes ago, Indian buyers are quite prominent in the auction, and it seems likely that that will continue. It may also be that some of the holders of cashew stock in Vietnam would be quite happy to see this auction steady. Obviously, if they are holding stocks, they want to see the cashew market, the raw cashew nut market, stay quite strong so that they can get the opportunity to move along their stock before the new crop comes along in February, March. Just before we finish on the market, I noticed this story during the week. I like to finish with a bit of good news, and it is a difficult story, the cashew market right now. But what we are seeing is that supermarkets in the West, and as you will have seen earlier, the lag in terms of demand has been in the US and to a lesser extent in Europe. But what we are seeing is that supermarkets, and about 80% of the cashews are sold through supermarkets in both of those regions. Supermarkets are starting to cut prices. This is a story from the UK, where they're telling us that prices have dropped, or inflation has dropped to 5.2% from 6.2%. So a lot of this is by the easing of prices in supermarkets. So food prices are coming back down a little bit, and supermarkets are looking to offer some better value. Now, this could be the start of a situation where the lower raw material prices start to be reflected on the supermarket shelves. We haven't really seen that so far. So just to remind you, although we've seen 12-year lows on cashew prices, we have not seen those prices reflected in supermarkets in Western countries. If that starts to happen, we should start to see demand pick up again in those markets. And as I say, with demand pretty strong everywhere else, that could be an interesting catalyst in the market. So we're looking at some harsh realities and some interesting questions as we look at the market now. So the realities seem to be that from West Africa this year, given the shipments, 2.34 million tons imported into Vietnam, 964,000 tons imported into India by the end of September, West Africa will have a pretty low carryout. The only new raw cashew nuts coming to the market in this period until February would be in East Africa and Indonesia. The Brazilian cashews will come to the market as cashew kernels. That's about 400 to 450,000 tons. That starts to look really tight. Export kernels shipments remain strong, and kernels prices remain steady, and perhaps we have seen the bottom of the market, but no more than steady. There's no sign of any sharp increase in prices. There's no sign of any speculation on cashew kernels. There's no sign that the market will start to form one of those squeezes or bubbles that we sometimes see at this time of year. There are questions too, and the big questions, I think, related to all of those realities are, first of all, how much stock is in Vietnam in transit? That means not custom cleared, that means not in the figures. How much is afloat? Again, we can't see that in the figures. How good is Indian demand? Well, we think it's good. Question as to how good has a huge influence. As I said, a 5% increase in Indian demand can add 80,000 tons raw cashew nut need. If it was more than that, we're starting to get into really exponential growth in the need. So this can turn around quite quickly. We haven't really seen a fundamental change in the market in the course of this year. Supply has remained slightly above demand. Supply is likely to remain above demand, except in cases of poor crops. Therefore, we've seen some low prices, and we've seen a lot of technical factors, especially in Vietnam, influencing prices negatively. What could change the fundamentals? The weather. So it's a year of a very strong El Nino, and the big question that's to be answered right now would be the weather in Cambodia and Vietnam during November and December. What impact can that have on the crop there, particularly in Cambodia? So we've seen so far in 2023, Cambodia has supplied 609,000 tons to Vietnam. If there was a crop problem, then we would see a change in the fundamental supply-demand situation, at least for that year. So when we think of El Nino, the key areas that can be badly impacted are Southeast Asia, in key areas in terms of cashews, Southeast Asia, much less extent would be South India, can be an influence but much less, and then West Africa, generally speaking, avoids the worst of the impact of a strong El Nino. We have seen an impact in other years, but we've never had a situation where we've had this impact and had such a large crop in Cambodia. So almost 1 million tons between Cambodia and Vietnam together. Problem there would be a problem for everyone. So there's an overview of the market, some realities, still questions to be answered. It'll become clearer as we get further into November. It does look as if the market is going to remain relatively steady on the raw cashew nuts. And for the time being, at least, I don't really see anything dramatic on cashew kernels. What does happen in this situation is when the raw cashew nuts remain fairly steady and when the market remains at times quite strong, that calculation for processors, African processors, Vietnamese processors particularly, who are dependent on the international kernels market, that remains quite a difficult calculation. And what the impact of that will be in the longer run is difficult to see. It may well reduce processing in Vietnam, and in Africa it means it's much more important for African processors to look and consider and realize what their competitive points are, what are their selling propositions for their customers in terms of reliability and alternative supply chains. So that's the market for now. In the second half of today's GME, we're going to talk about the Brazilian cashew sector. And I'm just going to give you an overview of the Brazilian situation. So first of all, let's just locate Brazil. In Latin America, Southern Hemisphere harvest during October onwards. Brazil is a huge country, as you know, huge consumer of different kinds of foods and a huge producer of different kinds of foods. When we look at Brazil's location, one of its great advantages in the cashew business was the short transit time to New York. At one time, that was down to 8 to 10 days. But it's also short transit into the European market. Production in Brazil is focused in the northeastern part of the country. And so you can see these three states, Piauí, Ceará, and Rio Grande do Norte, are the three major producers. Cashew nuts are grown throughout the whole northeastern part of Brazil. Cashew nuts are native to Brazil, by the way, and they were spread from Brazil all around the world. But you can see highly concentrated production, 88% in those three states, and in Ceará alone, 56%. Harvest September to December, maybe a little into January too, about 170,000 farmers. Most of them, 70%, are below 20 hectares in size. So farms, generally speaking, larger than they would be in African countries, for example, but still relatively small farms by Brazilian standards. If we look at production in Brazil, what we're seeing is that the overall production levels have fallen in recent years. The hectares have dropped from 700,000 back in 2012 to 425,000 this year. These are figures from Embrapa. It's a mix of figures from Embrapa, the Agricultural Support Organization, and the IGB, the Institute in Brazil. Average yield around 300 kilos, so not high. They've been using the dwarf trees for about 40 years. Dwarf trees, according to the figures I read from Embrapa, cover about 55% of the cashew plantations, and they're giving a higher yield of about 466 kilos per hectare. So you would have to say that the yields in Brazil are way below the international average, closer to yields in Africa. But we are looking at a different style of production there too. So the apple production is important in Brazil. According to figures I've seen, about 818,000 tons was the estimated production in 2021. Most of it's wasted, just like everywhere else, but not as much as everywhere else. The farms, I mentioned the 170,000 farmers as such, but there are 53,000 farms, 35,000 direct jobs. Estimates for indirect jobs range up as high as 150,000. We'd stick with the 35,000 direct jobs. And generally the product in Brazil is large cashew nuts with a mid to low outturn. So these are not the same cashew nuts as you would typically expect, let's say in a country like Benin or in Ghana. They're a little bit more like maybe Senegal, where you'd get, or parts of Senegal where you get very large nuts with a slightly lower end outturn. So production has fallen really based on, initially on drought, a better return on other food crops attracting farmers away from cashews, and that's partly due to low cashew prices and a slow return on investment on cashew trees. So what's happened is that growing cashews has become relatively less attractive in Brazil than it would have been in the past. So let's have a look at the actual production tonnages. And these are figures from the IBGE, the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Economy. So as you can see, over the years, there's been a general decline in production. Production back as far as 2008 was over 300,000 tons. In fact, prior to that, production would have been at one time more than 400,000 tons. But it has been falling. You could say steadily falling, with the exception of this large crop back in 2018. But for this year, the estimate coming out, the official estimate coming out, is under 127,000 tons. So we are looking at what appears to be now a relatively stable level of production in a range, depending on weather conditions. No real sign as yet that we're going to see a turnaround in the fortunes of production in Brazil. No real sign either that production is falling any further. So let's have a look at how has that impacted the export of cashew kernels from Brazil. Well, it's gone pretty much the same direction, but it's gone a little bit further and a little bit steeper in terms of the trend as a result of the increases in domestic consumption. So if we go way back to 2009, Brazil exported 48,000 tons of cashew kernels. In 2022, that was down to 10,000 tons. And the average of the last 4 or 5 years is around about 14,000 tons. So the export of cashew kernels from Brazil has fallen quite sharply over that period, in line with the fall in production. But there are also other factors in play. So if we look at this chart, this is actually a chart drawn from IBGE directly. Looking at it, you can see that what's happened over the period is that you're getting a kind of, maybe let's just draw a line in there. So this line is following the domestic consumption. So domestic consumption is this blue bar here, and above it, then you have exports. So when you look at domestic consumption, you can see that it has been quite volatile over the period, and it seems to respond to availability. So if there are more cashews available, that is a bigger domestic crop, then you get higher domestic consumption. But domestic consumption is really significant now in Brazil, and Brazil is a huge country. And so this has a big impact on what becomes available for export. You'll notice as well that Brazil does imported last year. I believe the figure was just over 14,000 tons. We might have another look at the imports in a moment. So taking 2022 as an example, 33% export, 57% into the domestic market, and I'm estimating a carry out, which would be normal stock held in factories, of about 10%. So we'll have a look at raw cashew nut imports. So Brazil hasn't been a big importer of raw cashew nuts in recent years, but if we go back to when the crops started to fall, you can see that there were in around 40,000 tons being imported, and steadily thereafter, year on year, relatively steady imports, but that's essentially fallen away now. Last year, 14,875 tons, as I was saying, imported. Where do they buy them from? Well, in the early days of imports, 2011 to 2013, Brazil was buying its cashews in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Guinea-Bissau, and even in Benin. But as time has gone on, you can see that the Cote d'Ivoire in grey and the total almost every year matches. So nearly everything is coming from Cote d'Ivoire to Brazil when they're importing. And it isn't easy to import raw cashew nuts into Brazil. There are a lot of provisions, phytosanitary provisions, other provisions related to the preparation of the product. So it's pretty tough. And I think that's part of the reason why the imports have fallen away. It's also related to the fact that the number of factories has dropped in Brazil in line with production. Where does Brazil sell its cashew kernels? And you can see mostly to what might be considered as regional markets close by, or markets that are high value. So when we look at the share of trade, what we see is that the United States and the European Union are the primary destinations in 2022. Interestingly though, destinations in South America have been coming up in their consumption of cashew kernels. A little bit more consumption in Argentina, Chile, Mexico and other South American countries. It's not making a dent in the world picture, but it is an interesting development. But Brazil does sell cashews all around the world. They're generally premium priced cashew kernels. They're often large cashew kernels, and they're regarded as high quality of ingredient level. So you're talking about a product which buyers often will trust to introduce directly into their food factory production. They will trust the quality, and it is generally food safe, high quality from Brazil. And this is why we see Brazilian cashew kernels trading at quite high prices compared to cashew kernels from other countries. Look at processing in Brazil. Well, it's mainly and always been a big business, big factories. And you can see these are two factories in Brazil, both huge. Today we've got very few factories, only 4 or 5 factories operating. They are mechanized, but they've always been, going right back to the 1970s, they've always been mechanized with local innovation. And local innovation has been a hallmark of the development of cashew processing in Brazil over the years, allowing for really high scale processing and allowing for processing that's suited to the local conditions. High levels of food safety management. Factories have a minimum of an ISO 22000, that's the food safety management certification. And generally speaking, what you're looking at is high quality product, high costs of processing, and that reflects on the farm gate prices, which are relatively low. Other factor in processing in Brazil is the fact that the byproducts industry is very well developed. You can see in the pictures, you can pick out the areas of the factories that are devoted to byproducts processing, and this has become a very important part of the cashew process in Brazil. So there's key lessons there for anyone investing in processing, particularly in African countries, of what works and what can enhance value. If we look at the processors in Brazil, and these are some of the big names, we see a number of common characteristics. Companies like Resibras with a diversified product range, Usibras with their Nutsco brand and selling under their Nutsco brand in the United States, importing and distributing in the United States. Usibras is also present in Ghana, as I'm sure you know, processing and importing Ghanaian cashew kernels. Looking at Amendoa's, again with a range of brands, a range of products, doing something a little bit different and doing something at a higher level of value. We're seeing the export of finished products and the domestic consumption of finished products. We're seeing ingredient production. So when we say ingredient production, we mean that the product is a food ingredient ready to go into a process. It's not a product that's simply prepared as a raw material that might need further cleaning, might need further preparation. They're producing products that are ready to go ingredients suitable to go directly into a food manufacturing process. And we see products, not only the cashew kernels or pieces, but we also see cashew flour or cashew meal, cashew paste, and cashew butter. And that's been going on a long time. I remember it's a long time ago now, more than almost 20 years ago now, in fact, importing cashew flour from Brazil, which went directly into a flour manufacturer that was making a nut-based flour as an alternative to the usual wheat-based flour that they were using. And that's going back 20 years. So diverse activity, branded activity, finished products and ingredients, as well as the standard cashew kernels that we're all more familiar with. The second type of processing in Brazil, and I have to say, first of all, this has been under real pressure in recent years. But I mention it because maybe this kind of processing has a place in Africa. And this is what they call the mini fabrica. So these are small cashew factories using machines, partly manual, partly machines, but well equipped, and in the range of between 100 and 1600 kilos of production a day. So they can be quite, those are RCN figures. They can be quite big factories, they can have quite a process, but most of them are quite small. And you can see the type of equipment. This is a package of equipment offered by one manufacturer. You can see the calibration, cooking, cutting, drying, small scale, local solutions. And these are often run as community projects or by small entrepreneurs. So it possibly has some applications. Now, one of the reasons why the Mini Fabrica worked in Brazil is, of course, that there is a localized domestic consumption. These factories generally are not focused on the export market, and perhaps that might be a place for them in some African countries. Very interesting. There's lots online about the Brazilian cashew sector. There's lots online about Mini Fabrica. A lot of it is well worth reading. Good place to start would be on the Embrapa website. Look for the section about cashews and look for the section about Mini Fabrica. You can also look at manufacturers like this company MF Rural, which offers this package of equipment. Worth a look if small-scale processing is something that interests you. Cashew apple, famously known in Brazil, always the quoted example. When we look at the numbers, they're not as major as we might think. So certainly there's a whole range of fruit juice products that use cashew juice. But what you can notice in a lot of them is that cashew juice is used as an ingredient rather than as the main product. These are figures, they're a little bit old, but they're interesting figures nonetheless. And we can see that about 145,000 tons is used in juice, most of that in mixes, and that from a production of 800,000 tons of apple. That's an estimated figure, of course. Cajuína is a Brazilian drink, small usage, very famous drink, but a small usage in that 20,000 tons used as fresh fruit, and then a huge amount used as animal feed. I think that's only an estimate. The figures are a little bit old, but they do give us an estimate that at that time, and bear in mind production was much higher at that time, Brazil was using about 250,000 tons of cashew apple in all kinds of products. What do you need to make cashew juice? What do you need to make these kind of products? You need an industrial infrastructure. You need a way to get the apples from the plantations to the factories quickly. You need packaging. You need essentially an already pre-existing fruit juice manufacturing and packaging business to this kind of standard into which the cashew nuts can fit. So when we look at the cashew apple sector, we shouldn't think that it is the answer to all the problems of the cashew business. We shouldn't think that cashew apple is the main story. The nut remains the main story. Just consider the values. Consider the values of a ton of fruit for juicing compared to the value of a high quality, well manufactured cashew kernel. So interesting, but let's not get carried away that cashew apple might be the answer, but it is an interesting topic. Other aspect I wanted to highlight about Brazil is the diverse cashew products. We've spoken about the cashew drinks, cajuína. We've talked about derivatives of that. We've talked about a whole range of products different to the usual cashew snack products or the fresh fruit. And I think that's an interesting aspect, and it may be particularly interesting in the short term, short to medium term, let's say, for the development of domestic markets in African countries in particular. You will see quite a diverse range of products in Brazil. You'll see in India, for example, you'll see a much wider range of applications for cashews and any number of uses. And I think these are important things to bear in mind, that cashew doesn't just have to be the typical snack food as we've become accustomed to in the Western markets. So what can we learn from and I speak from an African cashew sector perspective, what can we learn from Brazil's cashew story? Well, I think the first thing is that low farm gate prices eventually impact production. Low prices eventually cause production to fall, and there is a cautionary tale in there. That the new varieties, and I'm thinking about the dwarf variety in Brazil, new varieties work, but farmers will only take them up if they can be supported and if they can see the value of the new varieties. 55% uptake in Brazil, even though the outturn is about 50% higher. The apples are interesting, but as I was saying, not as big, not as huge in their potential as is sometimes portrayed. What else can we learn from Brazil's cashew story? Well, when we look at the factories, we can see mechanization works, innovation works, it improves the sector. Food safety, higher quality, most certainly in the case of Brazilian cashews, means higher prices. And processors can add more value than simply making the cashew kernel. So if we look at the three aspects, mechanization combined with local innovation, food safety and high quality, and we look at processors adding more value than simply producing the basic cashew kernel, we're looking at a situation where the job of the processor becomes a much broader, much more profitable, much higher priced operation. This is again getting further and further away from the idea that cashew kernels are a commodity and treating them as a food or a food ingredient. What else can we learn? Well, it's interesting to look at the mini fabrica as a concept, the product diversification, and of course, the byproduct. So the byproduct, I think, has two really important aspects. One, if not managed, it's an environmental hazard. If it is managed, it can be a profitable source of product diversification and development. We've seen in Brazil, and in recent years, we've also seen in Vietnam, that good use and marketing of byproducts can save factories from hard times when cashew kernel prices are low. So lots to learn in Brazil, lots to talk about in the market. I'll hand you back to Blessing to see if there are any comments or any questions. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, we do have some questions and a comment in the chat. Maybe we would just start with the comment first. So the first comment says, Vietnamese importers and processors have been citing unfavorable RCN prices, especially in Africa throughout 2023. And yet, business was going on at a record volumes, I might add. Would you like to react or respond to that, Jim?
Well, this is the topic that we discussed last time and the time before that in some depth. And I think when we look at it, you know, is cashew processing especially profitable for Vietnamese processors today? No, not really, because raw cashew nut prices are high and kernels prices are low. Are they going to stop doing business because it's become a marginal activity for them? No, there's no indication of that. So I think they keep going. I think they continue to, under fairly difficult circumstances, making relatively low margins, they continue to try to do business. That can't continue forever. But for now, at least, that's a reality. I don't think that we should conclude, because volumes are high, that necessarily cashew processors in Vietnam are making huge profits. I don't think they are. We do know that there is pretty good profits made in the raw cashew nut trade for many people, and that those have an impact on the sector in general. So it's a multifaceted question. It's a really good question. It doesn't look as if it's going to change, but the question really for me is, how long can that continue? And I don't think that can continue for too much longer. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have a question here, and it says, in your opinion, when will consumption data also be accounted for as much as export and imports in the case of Africa? I find it interesting and disturbing, as mostly the complaint centers around the cost of buying at the supermarket.
Consumption data from supermarkets is available. You can buy it. It's very expensive. You can buy it from agencies like Nielsen, but you're going to pay a high price for it. There are reports, monthly reports, weekly reports, depending on what you want, on retail sales. We're not going to get access to them anytime soon because we're probably not going to pay the price for it. It is interesting. It's pretty clear, and it's clear right across the nut sector, as the questioner says, that most of the complaints are about the prices in the supermarket. This is from Western markets. It is amazing for many people that at the end of 2022, supermarkets in the US put the price of nuts up when the price of the raw material was coming down, and that applies to cashews and almonds and all other nuts too. But that's what happened, and that was justified on the basis of other costs, and it was justified on the basis that if we're paying more for our energy, if we're paying more for our trucking, that we're going to have to put up our prices, and they put up prices for all products. So I think it would be very interesting to have consumption data. Consumption data, it can only give us a certain amount of an indication, in so much as that the nuts that might be consumed, having been purchased in supermarkets today, they might have been bought a year ago. Buyers buy forward, the nuts are imported, they're processed. So import figures do give us a very good indicator of where the market is going. What happened in 2022 was that the imports were there, the stocks were there for processing, but the consumer demand was not there. And a lot of people got caught with too much inventory, and as a result, they decided to stop buying. And we saw this trend in the second half of last year, where people said, well, we're going to use our inventory. Let's not start moving anything at origin. And they just waited, and demand dried up. So I'd love to have real-time retail data, but I'm not going to pay for it, the kind of prices that I would need to pay. So we keep sticking with the imports. We think that gives us a good indicator. We compare it with shipments, and that gives us a good indicator too. And that's where we go for now. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have another comment here before we continue with the questions, and the comment goes like this. I believe that we continue to send personnel inspectors to African locations to get and check the RCN until Africa have changed policies. Many local leadership, as well as main operators of African producing countries, declared their domestic consumption and developed processing cashews instead of exporting of RCN. This is a threat/risk.
That's an interesting comment.
Jim, would you want to add anything to it, or we move on to the next question?
Well, I think that, if we think about threats, so first of all, let's look at supply, let's look at production in African countries. Let's look at the development of processing in African countries. There's no prospect in the short term, in the medium term, of African countries processing 100% of the raw cashews that they grow. And therefore, there is no real difficulty for Vietnamese or Indian processors in sourcing enough raw cashew nuts for their needs, at least until the end of this decade. After that, it might change. After that, depends on how production goes. How production goes depends on what price you pay farmers for raw cashew nuts. So if you are concerned about your supply of raw cashew nuts, the way to address your concern is to reward farmers fairly for the job that they do in production. If you don't reward farmers fairly, they'll grow something else. They'll move somewhere else. They won't be interested in the cashews anymore. So the idea that one beats up the raw cashew nut price, says it's too high, tries to knock down prices at the farm gate, and then complain that there's not enough raw cashew nuts or that there's a threat is actually circular logic. If you want more cashews to process, pay better prices to farmers. I think it's as simple as that. Blessing. What about a question?
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, what can Africa learn from the decline in production in Brazil?
Well, great timing, because that question is exactly the same answer. Because one thing I think that it teaches us is that let's look at farm gate prices and consider the impact of farm gate prices on production. Producers of cashew nuts will respond to fair pricing, and they will respond to better pricing that rewards them for the job that they're doing. That's the first big lesson. The second big lesson for me is that we need to pay attention to the impact of climate change and to adapt to climate change and what that holds in store for us. Now, fortunately, cashews have a certain amount of resilience in that respect, but they're not thoroughly resilient. If you get droughts, you get lower yields. The trees may not die, but you will get lower yields, and therefore the economics of growing for those growers will change. Their incomes will change. They may look for other things to do. So I think those are the two key things that we need to learn from the decline in production in Brazil. I think we should also learn from the survival of those factories that have done well over the last 10 years and how they have concentrated on quality processing, high quality products, food safe products for export and domestic markets. And looking at those two aspects, I think there's actually quite a lot to learn in Brazil. And this is the reason I wanted to highlight it today, because sometimes it's a country that we don't look at often enough from the cashew point of view, especially from the African cashew point of view. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just before I take the next question, I'd like to mention that if you would like to interact, with Jim live, you just need to use the raise your hand feature and would allow your microphone to interact with Jim. Now, Jim, over to the next question. How can African processors work together to influence European kernel markets?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And it is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. It's on my mind. It's on many people's minds in recent years. I think firstly, the first job is to influence European buyers so that they're aware of the African cashew sector, that they are aware of the opportunity in Africa, and that they understand that although today African processors may have higher costs and may need higher prices than some of their counterparts in Vietnam, that won't always be that way, and that in time, a close supply chain, competitive supply chain for markets in Europe will be critical. So for me, I think African processors should work together to talk to European buyers. It's the old difficulty. We're all competitors in processing, but we're also sharing the same interests and the same objectives. And first thing is, let's work together to tell European buyers that African cashew kernels are high quality, and that we've seen. Let's work together to make European buyers aware of the opportunity in the African cashew business. But also I think that African cashew processors can work together to set standards so that we don't get a handful of less efficient, less reputable processors causing problems. Processors need to be transparent. We need to address issues. If there's pesticide residues, the issue needs to be addressed. No point in hiding from it. If there's issues of food safety, the issue needs to be addressed. If there's issues of labor or environment, these issues need to be addressed openly. They need to be addressed in a transparent fashion. European buyers will appreciate that. Last year, African processors had about 16% share of the European market. That's really significant. It's more than double the share of the US market. In that, we can see that European buyers are interested to develop their supply from African countries. They do understand the environmental impact of sourcing cashews from factories that process them close to where they grow. And they do understand that that may need them to pay higher prices, at least in the shorter term, in order to develop a long-term supply chain. To do that, processors need to work together. You can't sell the idea of a more sustainable, higher quality sector individually. People, processors need to work together to promote this, and it needs to be done in a modern, reimagined way. The old stories of help us out, we're African cashew processors, don't work. The stories of we're more sustainable, we're talking about quality, we can offer you traceability, I think those kind of things will work, and they're best done together. So trade associations through the African Cashew Alliance, particularly working together, can have a huge impact in the European market, especially, and that impact can be quick. I mean, there's no reason why the current share, the 16% share, shouldn't double within 2 years, I would say. The processing volumes are there. There are other problems, of course, but if buyers are aware of that, I think they'll start to react a little bit more positively. It would be nice to see it. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question says, do we see a change in the number of kernel buyers? From your selected import figure slide, most European volume seems to be up this year, with the exception of Belgium. Does this have anything to do with a change in the number of buyers?
I think there is definitely a change in the number of buyers in the long run, and there's a consolidation. There's no doubt in that. When there's a consolidation, obviously you get bigger players, and with the bigger players, if they make a positive decision, you will see an impact on imports. At the same time, I think that the increase in imports this year is probably not to do with that factor, although I fully accept that that is a factor. I think it's simply to do with the fact that we reached such a low figure last year, and that the underlying fundamentals of cashew demand are very strong, and they're particularly strong in the European market. So yeah, long-term consolidation in the market does have an impact, but it does. I don't think it influences immediate and short-term buying patterns. Blessing.
Thank you, Jim. And the last question that I have, okay, it says, I want to know how to penetrate the US market, and what is the 2024 cashew imports projection?
Yeah, I think everyone wants to know how to penetrate the US market. So the US imports about 200,000 tons of cashew nuts every year. Most of that, more than 3/4 of that, is cashew kernels. The US buys whole grades, it buys pieces, which is always interesting. But it is quite a price-conscious market. So issues of sustainability, diversification are not as important in the US market, for now at least, as they might be in the European market. The private label in the snack nuts sector in the United States has become quite strong, and this also makes buyers very price conscious. So the first thing I think in the American market is to very carefully select your buyers. So assuming that you don't want to sell at the same low prices that we've seen from the main supply country, Vietnam, you need to pick your buyers selectively in order to identify buyers that need what you can offer. So if you're offering a quality, high quality product, if you're offering a traceable cashew kernel, if you're offering, let's say, a lighter color, maybe with less blemishes, less shriveled kernels, all of those things, you need to offer buyers who will value that. if you approach the US market and you say, look, I need $2.60 FOB for my 320s, the market today is between 240 and 250, depending on what kind of a processor. If you say I need 260, you need to know who you're talking to, and you need to know what you're offering them and why they would support you at a higher price. So it's a tough market to crack. Vietnam has got an 89% market share in the US market of the normal raw cashew imports. The prices from Vietnam are highly competitive. So it's about, in the early stages, finding buyers that appreciate what you can offer and trying to negotiate slightly better prices. Then you need to get your process so competitive that you can compete on price, and that too will follow. And then the US market opens up. But it is a huge market, and it's quite a mature market, but it has been growing. Growth there is not especially fast, but you could expect growth levels of around about 2% per annum once we get out of this current situation. So maybe from 2024, 2025 onwards. If you think about it, 200,000 tons is about 1 million tons of raw cashew nuts. So it is a huge market, and it's the second largest consuming market in the world after India. But it's a big topic, and marketing is very much dependent on the individual characteristics of an individual business, what it wants, its strengths, its ability to sell, its ability to communicate, the product it's producing, the cost structure. So think carefully before approaching the US market. Have you got what it takes? Then select the right customers, do good research on who they should be, and then get your communication right. You will sell in the US market, without a doubt. The key thing is to sell what you want to sell when you want to sell it. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just before we take from you what we should look out for in the next 2 weeks prior to the next GME, I'd like to mention that when we invite our participants to use the raise your hand feature to interact with Jim, you are off record. So whenever we ask for it, just use your raise your hand feature, and you are off record. We'll mute your microphone, and then you can interact with Jim. That said, I see someone hands up. Omar Jumbo Bade, please, you will be unmuted to interact with Jim. There will be a pop-up on your screen. Just accept it and you can interact with Jim.
Hi, Jim, can you hear me?
Hello, Omar.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Omar.
Hey, good. Jim, thanks for having you again. It's been a very insightful presentation. And Africa Cashew Alliance, thanks so much for organizing this again and again and again. We hope to be following up as well. Gambia has been lacking for quite a while, of course, but the point I want to make is just to reiterate more on what Jim just said about having to do with African processors having to come together. That is what has been lacking, and that's the only reason why we are not realizing our potentials, and that is what is kind of deteriorating our own industry from seeing its potentials to either the European market or the American market. Individual countries cannot stand alone to be able to do all of it as is required in the international arena when it comes to the EU market and the American market and the US market. So the need for African cashew players to come together and then see what best suits them in pushing the agenda of transforming the African cashew industry would be very, very relevant. And that cannot happen without actions being taken. I'm not saying who should take the lead or whatsoever, but Africa Cashew Alliance is there as a center point with the need for us to move right now. It's key, or else it's going to take us decades, like Jim said, before we are able to realize what we want in as much as processing is, adding value is concerned in Africa. Thank you. That was my point.
Yeah, that's very well said. You're right, of course. There is a need for this. And there is the vehicle of the African Cashew Alliance, if well supported, can support this activity. But there's nothing like people getting up and doing it themselves, get active, start talking about it, see how it can be organized. And I'd be a supporter of that. And if you want to talk to me about it, well, feel free. My email address and my number's on the screen.
I will definitely do.
Please do.
Because we have counterparts that are currently on the ground from Kuntak and Badia Bank. They are talking about green value chain project in few countries. It's a regional project with Burkina Faso, Guinea, Bissau, the Gambia, Senegal. So part of it is, yesterday we had a validation meeting and something like this came up. Cashew happens to be one of the products that we are selected. So with that opportunity given, I will definitely speak to you after the meeting without delaying other people's time. Then you can see with your expertise and then raise something that could be bankable in order for us to submit there and make a follow-up using our countries of focal points of trade ministries or commerce ministries and industries to be able to see how to harness such and then acquire the little resources that might be required in order to be able to implement this agenda at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for that. It's very interesting comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you on that. I also want to mention a couple of remarks in the chat. And I think, you know, I want to thank, I see more and more people from Vietnam joining us, and it's really interesting to get their perspective. And I see one remark in the chat that please understand that the price at the Tanzanian auction is not favorable. That's why Vietnamese enterprises still wait to see and observe. And I think that's insightful and makes sense. I'm not sure that Indian buyers will stop buying. I think prices might stay quite steady for the time being. We saw the remarks that with regard to quality, and I see some interesting remarks there that the just around the issue of the supply of raw cashew nut to Vietnamese processors.
Recording stopped.
And around the idea of how this balance between supplying raw cashew nut processors in Asia and supplying domestic consumption. And that is an important balance. And if we look at the processing in African countries today, there's still a long way to go. So that supply chain, it needs to be better managed, but it remains an important supply chain for the foreseeable future. Blessing, I'm not sure, have we reached the end of the questions?
Yes, Jim, we have. But before we come to an end, we would like to hear from you what we should look out for the next 2 weeks prior to on the 15th.
Okay, I think, so we're coming into November. So we're coming into a period of a lot of festivals in the US. Biggest one, of course, Diwali in India. Look for the results in terms of the consumption of cashew kernels. Look for comments after the festivals from buyers in terms of how they went. Critical things would be Indian consumption of cashew kernels in this period, and later between the Thanksgiving in the United States and Christmas in the United States and in Europe. Consumption around those periods can set the tone for the coming year. Look out for the continued progress of the Tanzanian raw cashew nut auction. It'll be very interesting to see how the crop in Tanzania actually turns out this year. Some forecasts of a minimum, I think, of 300,000 tons was mentioned at the last GME. Will it be that? Will it be a little less? Will it be more? It'll be interesting to see. Keep an eye on developments in Mozambique. The cashew harvest is ongoing there. We won't see cashews for export probably till January, but it's interesting. Again, a good crop is forecast in Mozambique. What will be the outcome of that? I'll be looking at the weather in Southeast Asia to see if it has any impact on the cashew harvest in Cambodia and in Vietnam. And I'll be keeping a lookout at the inventories and the movement of stock and the balance of supply for Vietnamese processors, and whether or not that causes people to maybe mark up their prices a little bit at the bottom end of the range. And I'll be looking also to see if the strength in the shipment figures of cashew kernels continues, as I think it will, for the rest of the year. So Blessing, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate that you take the time, that you ask questions, that you give comments. And please don't hesitate. If you ever want to talk cashews, you can see my contacts on the screen. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks to the African Cashew Alliance, to our interpreters, and thank you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another session of the ACO Global Markets Encounter. And to our very participants, thank you for joining us. We'd also like to appreciate our sponsors and partners who have continually made it possible for us to bring these sessions. Please note that the next session will be on 15th of November, and we do hope that you join us again. But before then, we would like to invite you to the 3rd edition of the Sahelian Cashew Forum Focus, which will be held from the 7th to the 9th of November in Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso. You may write to us at ac@africancashew-alliance.com for more information, but we'll certainly put up a flyer on the screen. And we do hope that you join us next week, Burkina Faso, for the 3rd edition of the Sahelian Cashew Forum. But until then, we do ask that you stay safe. Bye-bye.
Take care. See you next time.
contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la Covid-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous les avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière Cashew, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cashew, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cashew que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou, et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bongo, Albori, Zoukoline, du centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cashew. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité, que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export, and we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon de production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons ce que les femmes soient prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. MEA is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Je m'appelle Sinagberu Kalilaku. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadjo nous a aidés parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'Anakadi. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. On allait à une production de 50 000 plants. Bon, je veux avoir également un site modèle. Nous souhaitons que Benekadjo continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Bon, Benekadjo nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benekadjo pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, TechnoServe à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés.